Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series of Screen Talks. I'm Louise Tutt, the Deputy Editor of Screen International. We're delighted today's event is in association with the British Film Institute and the British Film Commission. And we're all here to talk about how the UK's new COVID-19 safety protocols can be adapted and used by independent filmmakers to get film production up and running again in the UK. I'm joined this afternoon by Adrian Wootton, CEO of the British Film Commission, who worked closely with the BFI Screen Sector Task Force to put the guidelines together. And also Sara Putt, who runs the lead agency for film and TV heads of department in the UK. Sara has already had some clients who've started work on TV shows, and she'll be talking a little about the challenges they're facing and finding ways to overcome. Gareth Ellis-Unwin is the head of film and animation at ScreenSkills and an independent film producer himself. He's here and he will explain how ScreenSkills is addressing the new training demands of crew created by the protocols. And also producer Kate Norrish, who runs Hillbilly films with Polly Lees. They were 10 days away from wrapping Reggie Yates's Pirates when the production was forced to close due to lockdown. Kate joins us to talk about how she and the team are prepping a way back in front of the cameras, using the new protocols perhaps as a guide. This session will be 75 minutes long, and for the first 30 minutes or so, I'm going to talk with our speakers. It will then be followed by questions from the audience. Please put your questions in the Q&A chat box, and my colleague Orlando will moderate those. The talk will then be available in full on screendaily.com tomorrow. So I guess the logical starting point is the creation of these new guidelines. Adrian, can you please speak a little bit about how they came together, for whom they are designed, and how they can be adapted to independent film productions?
Yes, certainly, Louise. Well, the guidelines came together as a really massive cross-industry exercise. There was a huge amount of work done. Obviously, Gareth and Sara were both intimately involved in helping to actually draft the guidance. We took advice and information from every source that we could, actually around the world, looking at anything anyone was doing, but actually getting very, very detailed advice from every area, every department within film and television. The guidelines were designed to look at film and high-end television. They inevitably biased towards scripted drama because there are complementary guidelines that the broadcasters issued for other kinds of primarily domestic television, and these were much more fundamentally aimed at film and high-end television and scripted drama. And what we did was we sifted a huge amount of information and input. I think it's the largest consultation exercise that probably a film and television agency's ever embarked on in this country and probably anywhere else, which is why they're so detailed. And essentially what we wanted to do was give a detailed outline of what we thought all the different challenges and potential solutions were for people to be able to shoot safely on location and off location, on set and elsewhere, whilst also marrying that intense production information with the most current government, medical, technical, scientific information and regulation. And the two had to marry together, because it's fine for us to produce a massive amount of production information over here. If it didn't conform to the government guidance, we wouldn't have been able to publish them, and we wouldn't have been able to get government endorsement for them. And that was a painful, exhaustive process in terms of both the consultation and the marrying. But we managed to achieve that with working with Public Health England and Health and Safety Executive, the Office of the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, government departments. I mean, pretty much every government department you can think of inputted, so that we were then able to publish the guidance on the 1st of June. And essentially, they've been operational ever since. And I guess the thing I probably should emphasize about them is that they're not something set in stone. They're not something that we've done as a massive exercise and then is frozen. They're live. They're constantly being updated. Every time we get anything that suggests that they should be adapted because either they're technically wrong or there's something that people learn as practitioners that needs them to be adapted, or the government guidance itself's changed, we will change them. We've already made some technical changes because of advice from people just saying, oh, well, I think actually it'd be better if you're looking at sound recording to think about that. But we'll also change them if there's any change in the government guidance on things like social distancing as soon as and as when that happens.
Thank you. I mean, that's a good moment to ask Sara, because you're involved in the consultation process, I know, as with Gareth. But what specific part of production or was particularly challenging when developing the guidance?
I think they all came with their own challenges. I'm not sure I could really say that one was any more complicated or challenging. You know, that's the amazing thing about production, isn't it? It's about how the whole is greater than the sum of the parts and how all of those elements interlink. And, you know, having done a shout out to all of my clients now, knowing I was coming to talk with you guys this afternoon to sort of get their feedback on how it's working for them. The interesting thing is, although there are some specific differences from department to department, and some specific kind of things that still need fed in various departments, actually for everybody, the fact that this guidance exists when everybody was feeling so insecure and so confused, and now they have this blueprint, they have this living document that they can adapt as per the needs of each project, is incredibly comforting and is a really, really useful starting point for everybody. I think there are then themes that are coming up, absolutely, across all departments, and those themes are still very much around what will individuals be responsible for, you know, what is the production responsible for, will scripts be locked off in time, how will prep work, because I think every department is feeling they need time. They need time to make this work. And I think there's some really interesting conversations going on around that. So I think for me, actually, it's much more about general themes than specific departments in some ways.
So what are the questions you're hearing from your clients? What are they asking you anything in particular about the guidance? Like, what's the question you keep hearing over and over again?
The question related to the guidance I keep hearing over and over again is, will there be time? Will there be time to do this? And, you know, some very interesting comments around, you know, that prep time is going to have to go back to being proper prep time rather than waiting for the script time. Mm. And, you know, the more people get together earlier, you know, it's that get talking, put all your heads of department on Zoom calls really early in the day. Get them having conversations about how they can work together. I think also a lot of departments are very interested in those kind of pinch points when departments have to overlap with each other. It's like I was talking to one of my designers who's on a project that are using that's using the protocols, and she was saying she's ending up, which isn't a problem, but in a bubble on her own, because she as a production designer needs to be able to communicate with so many different departments. So while her props team are a bubble and her set deck team are a bubble, she is a person that's actually going to have to interface with all those other departments. So it's really about time, I think, more than anything else.
Okay, thank you. And Gareth, what's interesting is the creation of this role of COVID-19 supervisor. And I know that you've been working very hard to put a framework of training in place to help crews and cast transition to these new guidelines. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Sure, but I'd like to sort of start with the other end of it, which is obviously we recognised by being on the inside of the development of the guidance that they weren't just going to be put forward into the world without interpretation and support. So what was very important to ScreenSkills throughout, which Adrian, the BFC and the BFI have been incredibly supportive of, was recognising the fact that there would be varying types of training and support required. So the first thing that's out the traps, which will happen before this month is out, is a free to use online course that will be hosted by ScreenSkills that anyone's welcome to undertake. It runs for 30 minutes. It's being developed by First Option, which are a health and safety specialist, and working alongside Skills for Health, who were instrumental in training the police force, the fire service, and some parts of the NHS on COVID-19 training. And that's a basic piece of training. The ambition is to get everyone's basic level of awareness up to a slightly higher standard. And it's built around 3 pillars of how do I keep myself safer, how do I keep my colleagues safer, and how do I keep my environment safer. So that's the first step, is to just try and get everyone up to that baseline. And there's a certificate that's produced at the end that production managers, line producers and others can use to verify that the individual's done the training. Sitting alongside that is a number of masterclasses that will run through July and August. Some of them will be very specifically targeted to this independent sector. And I think what's really important in terms of the support for the independent sector is if you look at the wider ecosystem of the screen industries, A lot of the inward investment that Adrian's responsible for bringing to the UK will have health and safety policies that are designed and devised in Burbank. They're the big studios. A number of the bigger productions in the sort of TV space will have public service broadcasters sitting behind them. They obviously have health and safety departments and resource that they can put towards this. But this is where the independent space is particularly exposed. You know, as independent producers, we don't have big health and safety departments on tap ready to jump in. So we've got to do a lot of this ourselves. And it was a particular pleasure to me with my independent background to know that this guidance and supporting training would be designed to help assist the independent space back onto its feet.
And in terms of accessing the training, producers can come directly to you, to ScreenSkills.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I would say we're easy to find, and we can put my contact details into the chat room afterwards, but please start talking to us and start talking to us early. There's a lot that we can do to help and support, but what we can't do is obviously field a call on a Friday night to say we're shooting on Monday morning and we need a load of help immediately. So to Sarah's point, you know, that long lead time and having time to assess the risk, work through with the departments, where their pinch points are and where their particular vulnerabilities are, and to start that conversation as soon as it's practical.
I think if I can just chip in, Louise, that I think that's a really important point, both and I commend ScreenSkills for all the training and education workshops and masterclasses they're going to be doing, because I think this is critical, particularly for independent film. But just to echo and reinforce Sarah's point, one of the things I think the guidance is really kind of crystal clear about, apart from working within, you know, the government regulations about social distancing, etc., which, you know, are the things that we can't deviate from. The way to make this guidance work, the way to make this scalable, is that advanced preparation, that conversation, that early planning. I think that it's tough because it means, you know, you're extending in sense your production time, and that obviously potentially adds cost. But without doing that, I think that particularly those individuals, whether they're independent films or smaller scale television, will really have problems, because it's one thing if you're high-end film and television that we deal with that does have large access to health and safety resources, but you can do that health and safety assessment, you can do that risk assessment, you just need to take the time and the pre-production and the prep time to plan much more carefully in advance.
Which is probably a good moment to go to Kate. Kate, you're in the unenviable position of having to shut down your London shoot due to the UK lockdown. But it does mean you're perfectly placed to talk to us now about the conversations you and Polly are having with Reggie and the cast and crew and getting up and running again. Can you tell us a little bit about those, please?
Yes, so we had to stop with 10 shoot days left. I mean, it's interesting hearing all of the rest of the panelists talking about time and that being important. We have regular weekly Zoom calls with our HODs and with Reggie, and we have kept in close contact with our crew throughout this entire period, almost since we were shut down, to continue a conversation of how do we complete the film. And so the publication of the guidelines is very useful, because exactly as you guys are saying, we're using those as a starting point to look at how we tailor those to the specifics of our situation. And these Zoom calls are happening regularly, and you know, we're not in prep. We are just beginning to talk about how on earth we mount this, because the weird thing for us is we're midway through a film, so we don't want to compromise on what we've already shot. What we don't want is people watching our film and going, oh, look, that bit was shot post-COVID and that was shot pre-COVID. We want it to look smooth. So it's so specific to us. And it's just those regular conversations, and all of the HODs, I have to say, are brilliant at taking the specifics and looking at how it works in our case, and then we're coming up with a whole set of protocols and guidelines just for us. The biggest stumbling block, however, that remains is that 2 meter distancing rule and actors. And whilst the guidelines are brilliant and really helpful, the really tricky thing is how do we work within that to pull off a drama that looks and feels as natural as it did before COVID, when we were shooting it before.
Which brings us to the suggestion of creating a bubble that I know lots of people are talking about. Have you considered that, Kate?
We have considered it, absolutely. What I'm still not entirely clear about is how we do that without breaking what are the current guidelines in terms of how we set up that bubble, because effectively bubbles at the moment seem to me, in terms of the government, only seem to be 2 families coming together, or 6 people sitting in someone's back garden. It's a very different setup for shooting. So whilst we like the idea of bubbles, it's how we can implement that and get the dispensation to say that's okay. And for us, for me, I know not everyone agrees with this, but football is analogous in the sense that football is a contact sport, and to some extent acting is a contact sport. And without the actors being able to properly do what they do best, you're not going to get the best stuff on screen. And it's how we work out how to, I think all the protocols behind the camera are difficult but manageable, and will slow everything up and will require more time and more money, and you won't be able to change things last minute in scripts, absolutely. But we need to really come to an understanding of how we function with people on the field of play to extent on our set, and how they can act without compromise, because we can't do everything at 2 meters distance.
Which is the crunch, isn't it? I mean, Adrian, can you shed any light on the sort of legality, as it were, of creating a production bubble?
Well, obviously the government guidance on social distance is the government guidance on social distance. I think we've put it into the guide. We've reflected that in the guidance, and we're not advocating anybody breaks that, but it does. Obviously, there is this sense, and it's been used in elite football, about avoiding contact unless it's unavoidable, and restricting it in terms of the time. I mean, the analysis on football was very much about how much contact on a field a footballer actually had, and they actually did some scientific analysis to suggest that footballers actually only interact with each other on the field for kind of 90-second periods. And so they managed to actually demonstrate that they could be safe on a field, even though they appeared in close proximity. They weren't in that level of close proximity because they're passing the ball to each other. Obviously, it's different in film, but the way in which some teams some productions are working on this, apart from reducing down the amount of people, they're breaking people into teams and sort of isolating teams, and then restricting the amount of time those teams interact. There's work being done around, people not shooting for more than in 20-minute periods using cast. There is real difficulty. There's no 2 ways about it, particularly in the area of cast interacting and what we would call applied personal care, i.e. makeup, hairdressing and costume, particularly because the government we're waiting actually for, and we've got the most up-to-date advice in the guidance, but we're waiting for an updated set of guidance which is going to be produced so that hairdressers and beauticians and et cetera, can all go back to work next month. And that, I think that will modify some of the areas around personal care, which will probably change and make it slightly easier in terms of the context for film and television. But we're waiting for that guidance, and what we have at the moment is the best information. And what we're saying to people is, yes, do not break rules, but if you have to do things that are unavoidable, break into teams, try and avoid face-to-face contact. People are having to use PPE if they need to use PPE, and restrict the amount of time that they're in contact together, and just try and do what you can. But it's a question of, it's per project, it has to be modified and thought about. And I think that what we're going to see is that both the government guidance on applied personal care and the government guidance on social distancing are likely to change. And as they do, our guidance is going to change, probably over the course of a very short period of time.
Adrian, do you mind if I just comment on because something we haven't touched on yet is the interdependency between the creation of the guidance and the ability for the industry to look for further support to government. The guidance wasn't just created just because we felt that there could be a silver bullet to this horrible disease. And the inescapable truth is that this disease is still present. Anyone seeing the news today with the sad news that New Zealand have had 2 cases present and they had been free of this disease for 24 days just shows it's still out there. So the guidance was never going to be a silver bullet to removing the threat of the disease. What it is about trying to manage risk. And every production faces all manner of different risks. And when you're engaging on a big stunt or doing something like that, you look at all of the mitigations that you can put in place. And ultimately you arrive at a decision. The decision is it's either safe or not safe to do that thing. So the guidance wasn't really there to sort of become the enforcer. It was there as a practical toolkit to try and advise some best practice and some considerations about what a safe return to production might look like. And it's, you know, it's within all of our gift to not shoot. Now, we want to get back to work. We should be getting back to work, but it has to be safe for cast, crew, and everyone involved in the process.
And I think it's interesting that football have got this, managed to do this research and got this special dispensation that has allowed them, and obviously they're enormously wealthy and they've got this huge kind of rigorous testing that goes alongside it. I suppose for us, and it seems like everyone I speak to, aside from insurance, the biggest stumbling block is the 2 metre rule. And I suppose it's what, you know, health and safety is something us as producers manage day in, day out. It's what we do every day on set. That's why I think the kind of protocols in terms of just day-to-day stuff are not, whilst they're difficult and expensive, are not insurmountable. But the 2 metre and acting and whether or not we can get some kind of special dispensation or 15-minute rule or whatever it is that allows us to do that, that feels like that's what we really need alongside the guidelines, which are enormously helpful.
So it feels like nobody's in the independent sector will necessarily be back shooting in the next few weeks.
I just, one other thing to add, just in terms of the acting as well, which I think is tricky, which I haven't heard addressed much at all, and I don't have any answers for it at all, but is day players. I mean, so for us, we've got a cast of 3 and they'll be there for the whole time of the shoots. Brilliant, that's fine. We can create a pod and a bubble with them. But we also have other cast coming in who are day players, who I know at the same time are doing pickups on other films. So they're going into different sets. That is enormously tricky, because if it's like, how do we manage that movement between 2 sets? We can create this pod, but we have to have our day players come in, and do you say to them they can't go and work on something else for 10 days afterwards? Does that increase the amount of money we're going to have to pay them? There's kind of around the whole acting thing, it is quite tricky.
So
and I agree, every case is individual.
Are you coming up with any answers to that, Kate, or is it just watching?
Not yet.
Yeah.
Not yet. I mean, I think for us, what we're hoping is, because we have a relatively short amount of time to shoot and we have quite a small cast, we'll bring everyone in together at the same time, effectively create our pod, and then drop people off as we shoot, so that people can then go. But in effect, that's a sort of selfish point of view, because that's saying, well, we'll be all right, because if we can start before anyone else and get the people in with us, we're fine. How they then go on to other sets, I don't know.
And if the sense of this concept of a bubble does become a reality in the medium term, Sarah, do you think that puts anybody at a disadvantage? You know, if we're asking cast and crew to go away from their homes and families for 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 weeks, I mean, does that disadvantage people who are carers, perhaps women, perhaps, you know, all these advances we've made? I mean,
I think the answer to that is it can do, but only if we allow it to. And I think that what is amazing about what's happening at the moment, you know, not that it's something any of us would have wished upon ourselves, is that these conversations do have time to happen. And I think the fact we're raising these conversations means hopefully we can mitigate against that. Because the other thing I am very aware of as an agent for behind the camera talent, and I'm sure these guys all are as well, is the stress and trauma that an awful lot of people in this industry have been through, which is again why the guidance has been extremely helpful to give that sense of sort of a concrete starting point. But there are worries about people going back and feeling very stressed and nervous about being back in the workplace. And there are concerns about, you know, people with families at home. But then one of our female first ADs, we were having this conversation with her, and she's a mum as well. And she said, whenever I'm on a job, you know, that's what I'm doing. And I have to sort out childcare. So I'm not sure that part of it is necessarily so different. But how those bubbles are going to work, again, I would just counsel and ask for honesty and openness in having those conversations with people and being really clear. I think the other thing that a lot of people are very concerned about I'm seeing this, I'm a trustee of the film and TV charity who've been doing some fantastic work around mental health and well-being, which, you know, is feels even more relevant at the moment, is if they don't understand where the limits of their responsibilities are. So again, the more that, you know, fantastic producers are prepared to sit down and have those conversations with their heads of department, with crew, how we repurpose the trainee role, how we make sure we don't lose that talent pipeline. There's so much good stuff that we can actually do in pressing the reset button, that actually we can make this a really positive experience, not just a negative one.
No, and I think just chipping in, I mean, you know, this is about independent film. I think the thing is that Gareth's right, that Sarah's right, that this is all about management of risk and risk. You know, producers, Kate said, producers manage risk every day, and it's really a question of adapting that risk management knowledge into this new environment, using the guidance as appropriate. And everyone's going to have to make those decisions about risk management. And the most important thing, I think, is that communication and sharing of that risk management and the decisions that people are making, and encouraging not only a responsibility from the producers and the employers, but the employees have to be part of this kind of social contract as well. You know, they have to be responsible for their own health, because actually the most likely scenario of any kind of outbreak on a set is not going to be caused by working on the set. It's people bringing it into the workplace. That's what's happened in football. Actually, in any COVID outbreak that they've had since they've been back in training, it's not been on the training ground. It's not been on the sports field. It's because somebody's actually contracted it at home or from, you know, a family member. So people have to take their health and follow all of those procedures very, very clearly. And that's why the thing that Kate said about day players is going to be difficult. And there may have to be boundaries that people apply, at least for this period, that they potentially wouldn't have applied before, in order to protect themselves and their productions. But I think the positive thing about the guidance is that where you have those larger scale productions that have the resources to build testing facilities on studios, which is what's happening at the moment in some of our larger studios, and there is regular temperature and COVID testing going to go on the major studios in the UK, is that thousands of people are starting back to work and are going into that pre-production. So the guidance in one context has worked. And for me, the important thing is that we bring the whole industry. We've got part of it starting to go back, and we've got to work very hard together to get all of the industry back. And that requires additional challenges. And, you know, insurance has already been referred to.
I mean, the insurance issue is a really knotty one. And, you know, let it not go unsaid that there is a lot of lobbying going on at the moment at a variety of levels, that just as we experienced post 9/11, where insurance was very difficult to obtain and the government stepped in as the insurer of last resort, in that circumstance, you know, we are lobbying heavily to try and get this particular industry supported on the insurance front. But it does worry me when people talk about insurance in the absolute. It is not that productions are not insured. At the moment, there is a summary exclusion against any losses incurred that are specific to the communicable disease known as coronavirus and COVID-19. Your equipment insurance is still in place, your employer's liability is still in place, your public liability is still in place. And, you know, I've had a number of independent producers reaching out to me, actually trying to see, okay, how do we try and minimize the risk to such extent that actually the crew and cast could go back in, and if we weren't to suffer an outbreak, might actually get through those last few days of filming, or if it's on a short, might get your show shot out. That is a way of looking at the same conundrum, but it's not right to say that all insurance is cast aside at the moment. It's specific to this particular issue.
But the danger for independent producers who have financiers is if you do all of those safety things and yet there's another lockdown that's completely out of your control, it's who is covering those costs. Because I think that was a real shock when it first happened. We're very lucky. We don't have a COVID exclusion in our policy because we got our policy before COVID. So we're actually, that is a barrier we just don't have to deal with. If there's another lockdown, we're covered. That's a very important point you raised, Kate. I mean, I was scratching at this with a broker friend of mine, and anyone that took out their insurance prior to February the 15th is highly likely to still be covered. So it is the abandonment costs which are an issue. But, you know,
if you're part complete, or indeed your shoot is so short, I mean, look at the advertising world. The APA are getting back on their feet, and their biggest way that they are mitigating risk is the fact they only need to shoot for a short window. They might only be shooting for a day or 2 days. So it is different, and it is, absolutely bespoke to each individual production.
But if I can just add to that, I mean, Gareth's referred to lobbying. I think, just to be clear, it's more than lobbying and saying to government, you've got to do something about it. Actually, what I can say without breaking any kind of confidential discussions is, the industry, and Gareth has been part of this, the industry has, including with the broadcasters, independent producers, large scale producers, has submitted a series of proposals to government, insurance proposals to government, which they've consulted with insurance companies, insurance brokers on, and government are considering it. It's a very, very live and delicate situation. I can't predict the timescale or the outcome of it. But the government, what I will say is that the very highest echelons of government, they are listening. They haven't thrown it out and said this is ridiculous, or, they are recognising the significance of the situation. John McVeigh and his colleagues at PACT have been very, very active on this. And there is a proposal being considered and discussed by government and government ministers and officials. So I've just got my fingers crossed that listening keeps on, and that we do arrive at a positive outcome. I can't say we will. I can't say that, that it's definite, or, as I say, a timescale. But I can say that a lot of work has gone on, very detailed work has gone on this, and the government is actually formally looking at it.
Thank you, because I mean, obviously insurance is the elephant in the room here, isn't it? Well, no longer, but yes. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to go to some questions from our audience. Costs are inevitably going to go up due to the necessarily longer shoots and crews having to be kept to these tight social distancing guidelines. How worried are you all that the trainees that have become regular fixtures on sets are going to be the first to be cut? These trainees are vital to create our workforce for the future, and also a diverse representative workforce. Is it a likelihood that it will be trainees that will be cut? Sarah, have you heard anything about this?
Well, we run our own in-house trainee and foundation trainee scheme, so it's a subject very close to my heart. Not in my small way if I have anything to do with it. No, I would say that the majority of decent, good producers that I'm lucky enough to be dealing with are all absolutely aware that that is our talent pipeline, and we need somehow to preserve it. I think it is difficult because they're not going to be able to be on set in the way that they have been. So I think it's more about conversations around how we repurpose that role. And also, what we're very much doing is trying to manage the expectations of our trainee cohort for this year, and make them aware that they need to be doing the fantastic training available through ScreenSkills. They need to be skilling themselves up, around how sets are going to look, how things are going to function. And they need to understand they're probably going to be doing a lot of cleaning of equipment. But that's fine. They will still learn, and they will be there, and they will have built, their networks, communities. And it's not always going to be like this. We're not going to be filming, it feels like forever at the moment, but we're not going to be filming like this, hopefully by maybe even this time next year. So I think as long as we can keep that role going in some way, so that people are ready then to kind of take on more of an onset role when that's possible, then we should be okay. But we have to be aware that it is where, we are changing the industry and making it a more diverse and inclusive industry, and we mustn't lose that.
Yeah, I agree. It's really important. I think the point for us, I don't think we'd not have trainees, but I think the way we would treat any actual shooting is like a locked down set. So I probably won't be on set. There'll be far fewer people on set whilst we're filming, but actually we might need more crew behind the scenes. There is a balance of having more people to keep the stuff going quicker, so that the shoots don't just expand forever because it takes so much time to clean everything and do everything else. That we will want trainees, but what we might be all doing is keeping at a distance from the set, but there's still a lot of learning that can be done from there. It's really important.
I mean, to both Sarah and Kate's point, at ScreenSkills we manage a cohort of 250 trainees on our trainee finder schemes across HETV and film, and they're still very much engaged. We've been putting more training into them. We've been educating them that the roles may have shifted since when they onboarded at the start, but every production I'm talking to is echoing what Kate's saying, which is they will have an essential role, although that role might shape shift a little whilst we're in this period of adjustment.
Yeah,
and they might actually be ahead of the game, because everyone is starting on a level playing field in terms of learning about COVID, and they'll be learning at the same time as we are.
Yeah, certainly in terms of our cohort, our Equal Access Network, we're going to be providing opportunities for them to all, there's about 1,000 people in that, black, minority and ethnic young people from across London. They are going to be provided with health and safety training as part of the basic work that we're going to do in the Equal Access Network. Because I think, particularly in the wider world, what I don't think any senior industry figure could see is, with the emphasis that there is on diversity and inclusion and everything that's going on at the moment, the idea that we would narrow our focus to widen and diversify our industry would be completely unthinkable, I think. So I think we're all committed, and not just the people on this panel, but across the industry, in ensuring that those young, talented, creative people get the opportunity to work with us and work, and have a long-term sustainable career in our industry.
And it's important, therefore, that the training is really widely publicised and free. It's available to everybody, because cost will be a massive barrier.
Yeah,
you're absolutely right.
I just mentioned that, I mean, we've talked about aspects of this, and absolutely access shouldn't become the victim of getting the industry going again. And I think definitely everyone on this panel and probably the broader audience are keen to see the strides that have been made, not forgotten or lost. But I would also encourage us to start to think that this has been a bit of a reset button on the independent film model. And I don't think any of us would suggest that we were in particularly rude health before COVID-19 hit. Independent film was under a lot of commercial and other pressures. And I know that what this period of time has done has got some revitalised discussions going on about, the role of insurance, the role of a completion guarantor, the process of closing finance on an independent film, how some of that could potentially be streamlined up to a certain budget level. So I'm sort of seeing a bit of opportunity here as well, that we could actually try and come out the other side of this with a slightly better independent model.
Yeah, that's interesting. With the talk of making sure that we have our diverse workforce, we have a question from the audience that has just come in. Let me check. From Kwesi Dixon. He says, we know COVID-19 has a disproportionate effect in both mortality and morbidity on people from BAME backgrounds. Why do the BFC guidelines and other industry guidelines not address this? For example, by suggesting appropriate risk assessments for BAME people. Surely BAME lives matter to us. Adrian?
I can answer that. This has already been, when we published the guidance, this was raised with us. And actually, the guidance is, as I said, apart from the industry working protocols, the guidance absolutely follows in every respect all the, not just the language, but what government regulations have said. Having said that, we've already said that in the next review of the guidelines, we are going to look not just at the language, but of the detail of whether the guidance does need to be amended so it more accurately reflects those points in terms of risk assessments and the particular composition of the composition of the crew, the workforce. So we're listening, we're hearing that, and we will, as appropriate, amend the guidelines in consultation with government departments. So that is a next iteration of the guidance as we go forward.
Do you think there'll be similar work done on hiring people who might be in a higher age group, greater risk of COVID? Working with older actors, for example. Is it possible for the guidelines to address this, or just?
I think that's much more difficult. I think that whereas with the point about black and minority and ethnic crew members or workforce members, I say we are going to review the guidance. We're committed to doing that in that context. I think in terms of the actual employment of people, whether it's elderly people or I think that has to be based on the risk assessments that, you know, are particular to productions, and that will look at, you know, what's safe for the employer, what's safe for the employee, and make appropriate judgments on that. I don't think we can be prescriptive on who should or shouldn't be employed on particular projects in that way. I think that would be very difficult for us to address.
Thank you. Another question that's come in is, should cast and crew be signing disclaimers whereby they understand the risk and remove liability from the production company?
Well,
Kate? Or, yeah, Gareth.
Well, I mean, I think I think all of us have responsibility on each side, and I think the way we would approach it is we would certainly look at the employment contracts and expect a level of responsibility from our crew, but equally it's incumbent upon us as employers to be absolutely clear about the level of behaviour and safety that we expect. And if we make that absolutely clear, it's like any kind of guidelines in a workplace, if we make that really clear, because everyone I think has slightly different attitudes towards risk. And what we need to do is say, no matter your attitude towards risk, no matter where you come from on how you're behaving outside of this, this is the level of performance that we expect, this is the level of behaviour we expect within these protocols, and as long as you comply with that, that's fine. Now, it might be that we have to say to our actors outside of this, you know, in the same way with footballers, we're not expecting you to go out with your mates, and you know, there are sacrifices that probably need to be made in order to be able to function within the industry for the time being. But I don't think we want to start saying to people it's entirely your responsibility. I think it's incumbent upon all of us.
I think it's about transparency and clarity, and getting that documentation through to people. You know, certainly as an agent, I will be looking at those contracts carefully. And what would feel extremely wrong is if people were not addressing it, but popping a clause into a contract saying, oh, by the signing of this contract, you agree to all of these protocols. Oh, sorry, have you not seen them yet? You know, and no legitimate and you know, proper producer would wish to do that. And I think it's therefore about just being clear with your heads of department and your crew about what your expectations are of their behaviour, and what in turn you as a production are doing to protect them.
I mean, the notion of waivers and disclaimers has come up quite a lot in conversation, and the truth is I don't think legally you can sign away your inability to get ill or hurt. You know, it's a falsehood. So who would the warranty or the disclaimer protect? Well, the producer from any claim or lien brought by the person that fell ill. Well, the bigger risk is that the production doesn't go ahead. I've heard a lot about warranties and disclaimers, and my understanding is that you know you can't, even if you signed a bit of paper, you can't sign away your right to be healthy or safe. No.
I mean, Kate, are you intending to test your cast and crew, you know, to pay for like the antibody tests or even just the COVID tests? I mean, how much testing are you going to have to do, and how much can you afford to do?
Well, how much can we afford to do? I think is a big question, which we don't know. I think what we would plan to do in a way that it feels like, to go back to the football analogy, football is doing it, is I think we would try to have rigorous testing of those people that are going to be put at highest risk, which is our cast and potentially our director and potentially our DP. And when they're kind of active on the field of play, if we can set it in motion, we can afford it, have regular testing of them, then kind of surrounding that in the different teams, what we would be looking at doing is regular questionnaires for health testing. How are you feeling today? Much actually like we were doing before we shut down. Before we shut down, because there was little guidance around, we sent out our own memo about hand washing, we sent out our own memo about symptoms, and actually by the time we finished shooting, we had 10 people self-isolating. It's taking that kind of responsibility, but we aren't going to be in a position, we don't have the money to test absolutely everybody. So it is going to be those people that are most at risk, that might be breaking those 2-meter rules at certain times because it's necessary.
And if productions are clear as to what happens if somebody does either test positive or they need to isolate, will they continue to be paid for that week or 14 days, because again, those kind of things are going to affect behaviours as well. It's that sort of, you know, enlightened self-interest in some sense.
And just to add to what Kate said, I think that's really important because people have asked us about the guidance because it is so extensive and detailed. And I know Gareth and I have both been engaged in this. It's about scalability and practicability. And what Kate has just, you know, described there is exactly an appropriate for her project in terms of risk assessment, how they're going to use testing, because the guidance doesn't say you should test everybody, you know, etc. Some of the large majors, as I said, they're building testing centers on the studios, and nobody is getting into a production without everybody testing. But that's not what the guidance says. That's their decision in terms of what they want to do in terms of that particular production. It is about scalability and practicability whilst ensuring that you're doing everything you can to keep everyone safe and healthy.
Thank you. Another question, it's come from Greg Collins, and he says, so studio facilities, which are usually of a great square footage, will be able to construct a safer environment provided they follow the government rules, segmenting areas for multiple production. His question is, how do you control remote settings and or more confined areas like a subway platform? What metric will be implemented with local communities to alleviate their trepidation with this introduction of crews and actors into their space? Has that come up with you, Kate?
It has come up with us to the extent that we've started talking about talking to local councils about getting licenses to film, and I think it comes under that whole health and safety issue again, which we would do normally with the council. We would have to provide information about how we are making the area we are shooting in safe and not affecting the general public. So that what we don't know at the moment is how councils are feeling and whether they're going to give us permits to film. And I think that's equally the same with if we're going into a private I don't know, some kind of location like a cafe or something that we want to film in, how we're going to have to make that completely safe. I mean, and it just expands outwards and outwards, yes, because we'll be shooting entirely on location. We have to for the rest of the 10 days that we're shooting. We don't have the luxury of shooting in a studio, but so it's a much greater health and safety discussion to be had in that context. And we've not tested the councils yet.
Can I just add, Louise, that actually we do have a whole section on location guidance in the guidance, and we have been reaching out, you know, not just in London, but to the nations and regions, working with the nations and regions, who have been talking to local authorities. There also is a set of, it's on the chat as well, that Film London have produced a set of location protocols that are a supplement and an addition to the BFC guidance on location specific protocols, which have been tested out with locations, you know, external and interior. So there is quite a bunch of advice there. Kate's absolutely right that obviously the in a sense the proof will be in the pudding, because local authorities have largely, they have, as Gareth said, for small advertising shoots, but that there hasn't been obviously any significant location filming in cities or in rural or other landscapes over the last few months. So there will be a certain amount of kind of, you know, let's see if we can make this work. But there's no two ways about it. The nations and the regions, the devolved agencies are all working with us. And I think anyone that's planning to go out on location, whether they talk to Film London in London, or they talk to Northern Ireland Screen, or the Welsh Film Agency, or Creative Scotland, there is advice and support there, and they will help liaise with the local authorities in their particular nation, region, to help with those issues.
Thank you. And actually, there's a question leading on from that, which, I mean, how do you think you can film a naturalistic looking scene on a street when members of the public will be wearing masks? Is that where our friends in post come in?
I suspect it might be. I don't think our guidance can kind of overcome that particular problem. I mean, I know that you know, certain people were keen to do some, you know, pickup shots before the streets got flooded again. But it is a difficulty. In all seriousness, I don't have a solution to, you know, in the sense of that real life filming. It may be that it's a post solution.
I mean, it's complex because the post is very, very expensive. Yeah. So do you go down the route of saying we'll shut off places completely and bring in SAs? That's a possibility, but then bringing in SAs, bringing in extras is difficult because they are people coming. They're effectively day players coming into your set for one day and then leaving. And whilst you might be able to do the 2 meter distancing with them, it still might look a bit odd. That's a real challenge.
The only other comment I'd make, Louise, is that there are certain areas of London which, in fact, we're actually, and other areas of the country that can double for more congested areas, but they're much quieter, and where you'd have the opportunity, it's a bit like, people use Glasgow, for example, for certain kinds of London, and outer London is now becoming more popular. Actually, this is to do with the congestion charge than inner London, and they're doubling. So you can look at doubling alternative solutions in quieter areas that you might be able to cordon off, where you don't have the same pedestrian footfall, without having to be in an absolutely central and congested location. And that's the kind of advice and information that the locations team in, as I say, in the nations, the regions, Film London, Scotland, Wales, etc., Northern Ireland, will happily provide and work with the productions on.
Thank you. Going back to the concept of bubbles, Brian Kaczynski asked, what is the panel's view on what mechanisms and timescales create a bubble? Maybe Adrian?
I mean, I can't give a kind of simple answer to that, because it goes back to all of this stuff we're talking about. It depends on the specific nature of the project, how many people are involved, what size your crew is, whether, location, studio, and it's running those appropriate risk assessments to then actually, in the way that Kate's been talking about, how you construct, isolated or separate teams that interact at particular times for very limited time frames and break up again. And I think that bubble concept, which we don't get into the bubble concept in great detail in the guidance, precisely because of its very particularity, and we're not necessarily endorsing the idea of a bubble concept. It can work, and people may choose to use it. But what we've tended to refer to in the guidance is how, you create kind of, in a sense, isolated teams that limit their interaction to each other and very limited interaction with other teams. And I think that there isn't a simple solution. I can't, and maybe Gareth want to comment, but I don't think there's no magic, kind of EMC squared formula for creating a bubble. It is going to be based on independent risk assessment.
I mean, just in the same way the government hasn't said your primary bubble are X, Y, and Z members of your family, or ABC members of your close social circle. It's not the place of the guidance to try and suggest what is or isn't the perfect bubble. It should just try and adhere to the underlying principle, which is you're trying to reduce the contact to the fewest people exposed for the shortest period of time. And I keep coming back to a working example. Anyone that's filmed in a prison or a high contagion hospital ward or at an airport has got used to there being certain modifications to how you work. If you're working at an airport, you limit how many people and how much equipment goes airside. If you're filming in a real prison, you limit how many people go beyond the sort of the security zone. So it's thinking about sets, whether they be on stages or whether they be in location, as having levels of potential contagion. And Kate described this really, really well. You've got those that are at the epicenter of this, which are cast, probably camera and director, and then you've got sort of concentric bands of activity that sit outside of that, going away from that nucleus. And it's about trying to limit the amount of time people or equipment cross those sort of concentric boundaries. And look, if anyone is struggling with conceptualizing this and they've got a shoot that they want to talk about specifics, get in touch. I'm more than happy to put the 28 years plus experience I've got in production to try and address some of people's specific project problems, because a lot of this is talked about in the abstract and we're expecting the guidance or something else to make it all work. And it's not going to be like that. It's going to be about getting into the granularity of the project, scale of production, other challenges. But if someone wants to sort of get in touch through ScreenSkills and riff with me on some of their problems, I'll be more than happy to help. Well, I'm suddenly realising with 711 potential projects to field, it will probably have to be moderated. But
I think it's also about the interrelationship between the production process and the development process. And far too often in our industries, those are kept separate. They're in their own separate bubbles permanently. And we really need that relationship to grow stronger, because more than ever, we need those working on the development side and that kind of the writing and that creativity to really understand the practicalities to some degree of what the production teams are then going to have to put in place in order to bring that script to life. So the more conversations as well those two sides are going to have, and scripts can be adapted and the heart of the storytelling can still remain, I think, in a lot of cases, but adaptations are going to have to be put in place. And the more those conversations occur, the better.
I mean, Sara, to your point, I mean, outside and away from ScreenSkills, we've pivoted 2 of our Bedlam projects away from it being actors, costumes, sets, vehicles, live action, to mixed media, blended archive, CG, animation, those other things. You know, ultimately, if people have a burning ambition to tell their story for the next reasonable period, we might have to just get inventive with how we tell those stories and reimagine those scripts and those formats. Or it might be just a case of waiting that little bit longer, because as we can see, things are shifting almost on a weekly basis, if not, you know, maybe a daily basis.
I mean, I think that's true. I think that's a very good point. I mean, I've said, not trying to be flippant, but the whole point is that we're in one of the most creative, talented, inventive, ingenious industries, you know, on planet Earth. And I think that there are issues, and a number of people on the chat I know have been talking about cost. There are challenges of time, of schedule, of cost, of practicality, of modification. But that is the reality we're living in. And I think that it is a question of having, you know, using the guidance, yes, as a roadmap, hopefully. Have to modify. It is going to have more pre-planning, more time, more energy around that, because we can't change the fact that there is a terribly threatening, dangerous virus, and we have to operate within the government guidance. And I think that in terms of costs, again, we're representing those costs to government. The BFI is doing work on those costs. We're recognizing that is a significant challenge, particularly for independent production and domestic television. And actually the solutions are there's no simple solution. The tax credits are there. They'll still be able to be drawn on. And the BFI itself is using some of its own funds to help ameliorate particular costs with interrupted productions. That's a very positive move they've made with their own funding. And I'm also aware that both in terms of television and film, is people are looking at their schedules and going, well, and this comes back to Gareth's point about modification. They're going, well, it was going to be 8 episodes. It's now going to be 6. You know, it was going to be 13 weeks. It's now going to be 11 weeks because we're going to have to cut the production schedule and to manage those costs. I'm not saying, as I say, we're not representing the government the challenges of doing all of those things, but I think that those are going to be some of the realities, that people are going to have to modify their projects and scripts and be ingenious about doing that in order that they can get them made.
I think it goes back to, sorry, Kwesi's question at the beginning there as well. It's about being ingenious about the project, but not at the cost of getting a really properly diverse representation of the world around us that includes everything, and inevitably that will have more cost, and people, whether they're from a BAME background, whether they're older, whether they have underlying health conditions, should not be discriminated against in this time period, and that is going to cost more money. And what we need is the commitment from the financiers that is understood, and it goes with insurance as well. You don't want to just have a kind of homogenous industry coming out of this. We need to keep that kind of going on. It's really important, and it will cost money. That's no doubt about it.
Adrian, you mentioned the tax credit, and there's a question from Helen Gladders who says, is there any news on an enhanced tax credit to support the additional COVID costs?
No, there isn't. I mean, obviously, this is a complicated and very sensitive question. We're aware that across government, there is a very large number of asks that have been made, not by just the screen sector, but by the creative industry sector. There's all kinds of propositions and proposals into Treasury. And obviously, we're also aware that the government spent an enormous amount of money which we as an industry have benefited from, whether it's the furlough scheme or the business interruption scheme or the freelancer scheme. So we're, with the BFI and with all our industry partners, being incredibly sensitive about this. We are talking to government about those costs. We've actually working with the BFI to get some much more precise idea of the range of costs across different production, which we're sharing with government. But at the moment, our position is very clear that our tax reliefs are intact. We're very grateful that the tax reliefs are there and are still able to be accessed by all of the productions, film and television productions, children's television, animation. They're not going anywhere. And we'll carry on representing the government about these costs. But I don't want to promise that government either has the resource or the desire to produce more money in this context at the moment. It's very much a wait and see. All I can say is that we're doing everything we can to make government aware of what the situation is with those costs that Kate and everyone else has been talking about.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to touch on that sort of cost versus finance issue. I mean, I talked earlier about a hope that we might look at the opportunity to improve the independent film financing model, because one thing's for sure, we're either going to have to get more money into our subsector, or we're going to have to become more efficient with how we use it. And, you know, money can arrive into the sector from a variety of forms. It can either be state aid in the tax credits, or it could be that there is some streamlining of the actual process. But at the moment, one of the things that everyone's talking about is the sort of direct cost impact of having, you know, filming either abandoned or delayed. A friend was asking me what I might be doing in this sort of scenario as an independent film producer. And one of the things I always knew I had was the trust of the crew and my suppliers and others, that if I was really put in a bind, I would be able to sort of leverage some of that goodwill. Because one thing's for sure, not shooting and not having things in production is no help to anyone. So, you know, would agents, would crew, would suppliers be amenable to the idea of sort of carrying a ledger of lost time, and that could be compensated, you know, for at some point, whether it's a deferral or by other means. So I think we're all in this together, and it's not going to be a single silver bullet solution.
I think the problem, though, I understand that, but I think the problem with that is then you limit the kinds of people that can work in the industry, because that is people that can afford to defer
Yeah,
their money, and a lot of people can't.
Yeah, no.
And I think so many, you know, what is it, over 75% of the freelance population haven't been covered by either of the government schemes.
Yeah, no.
I think it is difficult. It's challenging.
Yeah. And just so I'm absolutely clear, I'm talking about small margins. I'm talking about the 1 or 2 hours that might be lost across a week, rather than only giving employment to people that can go afford to be unpaid. I also recognise that a large percentage of the workforce have not been able to work for several months, and might, you know, quite like the idea that we're working together in a collegiate way to get back working. But I'm absolutely not proposing that this becomes the domain of those that are privileged enough to go unpaid. That's not what I'm saying.
I mean, on a similar note, a very similar note, Connor Matthews asks, our production was set to take 10 weeks of filming, and with the COVID restriction, we've estimated it will now take 12 weeks. The extra time will cost more than expected. How do we broach this with our financiers, investors, as we ultimately now need more money? Gareth? Well,
it's a conversation we're having right now. I think you just have to be totally upfront. I think what you have to do is be explicit about what the additional costs are and where they're coming and why you're doing them, and be able to back that up with health and safety assessments, and hope that your financiers back your project enough to want to see it made, to understand that there are those additional costs. I don't think we should be cutting corners. I think we should be asking for that money, and if you don't get all of it, then you need to talk to your financiers, because you can't compromise on health and safety. You just can't.
Do you have any advice on how to approach the finances in that way? I guess Connor's asking, is it about being direct and honest?
Yes, I think so. I think if you draw up your budget and you say, this is what we thought it was going to cost, this is what it's now going to cost, This is why it's going to cost this much. This is not just us sneaking in a few extra days shoots because we thought it would be a good time to do it, but you know, our days are going to be shorter because we can't work people overtime, because if they get tired, they might start breaking, the health and safety guidelines might start breaking down. I think if you're absolutely transparent with your finances, I think you just have to engage them in a conversation. I mean, that's exactly what we're doing. Alongside our Zoom calls with our HODs, we have regular meetings with our financiers where we talk about, this is the conversation we have with these people, it will cost 30% more because of this. And I don't know that we're going to get everything we're asking for. We've not got there yet. But I think you have to just make the case.
Okay,
and surely to any financier, it's not my area, guys, hands up, but surely for any financier, the fact that they are investing their money in, you know, a production and producers who are working with the guidance, who are taking this seriously, who are going to produce, you know, a really fantastic piece of content, but also do it safely and are much more likely to be able to deliver it because of those measures they're taking. That extra cost actually becomes a cost saving in some senses as well. I think there's an argument around that.
And I think just to back that up, I mean, obviously the whole point of us getting the guidance out, not just as an industry exercise, but to be endorsed by government in terms of the Health and Safety Executive, Public Health England, was precisely to provide that evidence that this was being done really seriously. And if a film or television production is using the guidance and is clearly and transparently using the guidance, it's unequivocal in terms of having those conversations with financiers. And whilst, of course, not every film or television program has public funding, but overwhelmingly most of it does, whether it's using the tax credit or it's broadcaster investment or it's lottery investment or it, you know, and all of those public funders are absolutely, you know, have, whether it's the broadcaster guidance, the BFC, they've endorsed it, they've supported it, they're absolutely aware of those additional costs, whether, you know, say whether it's the BFI, whether it's Channel 4, all of them. And I would have thought that if it's the private financier that doesn't necessarily have that level of understanding, you would be able to hopefully have a transparent, honest conversation and hopefully use your other financiers, particularly if they are from public sources where they understand the necessity for the application of the guidance, to actually help make that argument about why you do need that additional funding in order that you can make the thing that you actually passionately believe you have to make, and which has to be made in a certain way.
Thank you. Going back to the guidelines for a second, Judy Goldberg asks, can you speak a little bit about how the implementation of the guidelines will be regulated? Because obviously, I mean, they're not legally binding, but a good responsible producer and set is going to adhere to these guidelines. But I guess the fear is, and this may be with your clients as well, Sarah, that there'll be some sets that aren't run using these guidelines. Is there any way of, you know, is there going to be sort of an anonymous tip line at the BFC or something, Adrian? Or, I mean, what's the thinking on this?
No, I mean, we're not a statutory enforcement body. We are, you know, these are voluntary. They are guidance. They're not a, you know, they're not the 10 Commandments, Sermon on the Mount. You know, they're not that. And we cannot be an enforcement body in this context. However, this guidance is live, it's regularly updated, it's been promoted domestically, worldwide, and it has been endorsed very explicitly by the Health and Safety Executive as well as Public Health England. And the Health and Safety Executive, and it says so in the guidance, if there are instances of, you know, problems that are caused by COVID on set because people have behaved irresponsibly, the Health and Safety Executive have said they will use our guidance as a tool when they investigate. They have said that explicitly. So what we would say is that this guidance is not statutory, it's not enforceable, but it does reflect UK law. We had a Health and Safety Executive legal team look at it independently, had legal advice as well as Public Health England advice, and the Health and Safety Executive said they will use this as their benchmark. So what we would encourage people to do is use it appropriately. It's got, you know, every member of BEC2 knows about it. It was circulated to the entire 20,000 strong membership of BEC2 and all the other talent unions. So the workforce absolutely is available, aware of it. Gareth is doing, more health and safety training and workshops and educational briefings than we can shake a stick at. So there is no reason that employees and employers don't know that it makes sense to use it.
I mean, to Adrian's point, I think it does feel like a document that feels democratic, that so many voices fed into. Adrian would know the stats, but I alone spent one weekend collating 120 plus responses into one document. So many freelancers fed into this, that I think there is a sense of ownership out there in the community. And what I would also say to that is that this period has created way more of a sense of community in that freelance population. Because geography has ceased to be a barrier, because we're all living our lives on Zoom, there are so many conversations going on. There is so much collaboration within departments and across departments, between agents, between producers, that I think it would also be very, very foolish of anybody to think they could somehow ignore or work in a completely maverick way away from the guidance, because the industry is just too small and we're all talking too much.
And if I can just add one thing, Louise, is that Gareth has already kindly offered to work practically. I mean, apart from all the workshops and masterclasses and training there, ScreenSkills is offering more practical advice. There are more of these seminars. We really believe that it's an education process. If there are less experienced producers working on first-time features, etc., then we want them to talk to ScreenSkills. We want them to come into these information briefings and workshops, because there's absolutely no reason they can't apply the guidance and work safely within those parameters.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one last question. I'm going to read. It's from Ian Beaumont, and he says, does the panel think we are going to see an increasing number of films that were due to be filmed in the UK being made in countries abroad that have been less impacted by COVID and are less strict, therefore, in terms of things like social distancing? Might this in turn have a negative effect on the UK film industry generally in terms of investment, support, and so on, including when we come out of the COVID-19 era? Adrian, I suspect you might have a view on this.
I don't want to be complacent about this at all. Somebody asked a question about the impact on our visual effects industry, and we're incredibly committed to supporting visual effects and post-production and ensuring that remains one of the jewels in our crown as well, because it's a fantastically important part of our industry, and we're working with UK Screen Alliance and all of their members to ensure that they get the work and remain competitive. But in terms of the general competitiveness, of course, I would say this, I run the British Film Commission, but if you look at the evidence is that subscription services have gone through the roof. There is a massive, massive demand for more content, because actually those services have had their content banks empty because so many of us have been watching and consuming more and more. We've got a backlog, which thank goodness we're starting to put some people back to work on the studios to start eating into some of that backlog. But I see no evidence whatsoever that the streaming companies, the studios, don't want to do anything other than commission more projects and product. And the underlying strengths of our industry are still there. We have an incredibly talented, creative workforce. Our job is to support, nurture that workforce in exactly the ways that came out and sustain that going forward. And ScreenSkills has got a critical role to play there. We have to build more infrastructure, actually, that we need more studio space. We have the tax credits. We have already got amazing infrastructure. So the pillars of the things that made us competitive in the first place are still there. The demand is actually not there. The demand's getting bigger. So my view is that we're going to see more demand for what the UK has on offer. And actually the demand for making content here should get bigger, not smaller, as long as we address the things that have been talked about today, as long as we can get the industry moving, that we can work through the costs and the insurance and do so safely. I believe that our position out of the pandemic is potentially stronger with more demand for what we have to offer than it was before we went in.
Absolutely. And also the very fact that we have taken all of this so seriously, that guidance is so detailed and such a good blueprint, I think inspires comfort and a feeling of security. in those who are looking to get filming again, which again makes us an even more attractive place to be because we are taking this seriously.
And from a producer's point of view, wherever we go, COVID isn't just here. I mean, it's the case, as Gareth was talking about in New Zealand, you know, wherever you fly to, wherever you go to shoot, it might come and bite you in the bum. I think you can't guarantee that anywhere at the moment is any better. It might look it now, but in 2 weeks' time, it might look very different. So, I mean, for us, I think, you know, we just continue as we were before, trying to get stuff made here.
Thank you to everyone. That seems a very sort of positive note to end on. And I think overall it's been a very positive conversation, lots of great ideas. And I'm sure that our audience has got a lot from all of our 5 great panelists. Thank you so very much for taking the time to talk with us today. And thank you to the British Film Commission and to the British Film Institute for supporting the talk. And thank you to the audience. I hope that we've covered all your questions. Always feel free to contact us at Screen Daily if there's any topics you would like us to cover or anything that we've missed. This webinar will be available to watch in full on screendaily.com from tomorrow morning, and we'll be announcing our next Screen Talk very soon. Good luck to Kate for the production. Hope you get up and running soon. Good luck to everyone. Pleasure to talk with you, and I hope everybody has a lovely evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Bye.